In the heart of the Sierra Nevada, where winter showed no mercy and men killed for less than an ounce of gold, one prospector stood alone. Grady Monroe wasn't just fighting the cold, he was fighting for his life. Hunted by outlaws, trapped by the storm, no law, no backup, just a six-shooter and the will to survive. But out here, in the frozen wilderness, bullets weren't the only things that could kill a man. Some dangers you could see coming. Others were already inside. Grady Monroe had seen men freeze before, good, strong men who had spent too long in the high country without shelter. He wasn't about to be one of them. He pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders and urged his mule forward. Chapter 1. The Stranger in the Cabin. Grady spotted the cabin just as the last sliver of daylight faded behind the mountains. Snow had piled up against the walls and the roof sagged under its weight, but it was still standing, and right now, that was all that mattered. He stepped forward, then stopped. The door was open, not blown in by the wind, not cracked from the cold, just open. Grady's pulse quickened. He reached for the Colt Navy revolver on his hip and moved slowly, carefully. He had lived in these mountains long enough to know one thing: if someone had taken shelter inside, they might not be the friendly kind. Pressing himself against the outer wall, he listened. The wind howled, rattling the door against its hinges. Then, from inside, a creak. Someone was in there. Grady moved fast. He kicked the door open and stepped inside, gun raised. The fire was still burning, throwing flickering shadows against the walls. And by the flames, hunched and shivering, sat a man, a stranger. The man flinched as the burst of wind and snow followed Grady inside. His rough, calloused hands shot up in surrender. His face was gaunt, skin stretched tight over sharp cheekbones. His clothes were little more than tattered rags, barely holding together. "Jesus, don't shoot," the man rasped, his voice hoarse from the cold. "I ain't armed." Grady didn't lower his gun. He stepped closer, eyes narrowing as he studied the stranger. "Who the hell are you?" The man swallowed hard. Ezra Crowley. Grady didn't recognize the name, but that didn't mean much. These mountains were full of men looking to disappear. Runaways, drifters, thieves. Some left civilization by choice, others because they had no other option. "You alone?" Grady asked, his voice low. Ezra nodded quickly. "Swear it." He shivered, violently, holding his hands out toward the fire. "I got caught in the storm. Would have frozen if I hadn't found this place." Grady didn't move. His eyes flicked toward the table by the wall. A half-eaten biscuit, a tin cup with melted snow water. Ezra had been here for a while. Too long. "You picked the lock?" Grady asked. Ezra hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah." Grady clenched his jaw. His first instinct was to throw the man out into the snow, teach him a lesson about breaking into another man's home. But as he looked at him, the truth was plain as day. Ezra was starving, frozen to the bone. A dead man walking if he had stayed outside much longer. Grady exhaled through his nose and slowly, finally, lowered his revolver, but didn't holster it. "Eat what you need," he said gruffly. "Then you move on." Ezra nodded eagerly and reached for another biscuit. He ate like a man who hadn't seen food in weeks, barely chewing before swallowing. Grady moved to the window, peering out into the storm. Snow fell thick and heavy, blanketing the trees, swallowing the world whole. He didn't trust Ezra, but the man didn't look like a killer. Still, something didn't sit right. "You running from something?" Grady asked, not turning around. Ezra hesitated just long enough for Grady to catch it. "Ain't a place out here that ain't got trouble," Ezra muttered. Grady turned, watching him carefully. "That's so?" Ezra swallowed another bite, his gaze flickering, toward the door. "Ran into some bad men back in Sutter's Mill. Gamblers, cutthroats. Got into a mess with them. Let's just say they ain't the forgiving type." Grady narrowed his eyes. "They after you?" Ezra let out a dry, nervous chuckle. "Lost 'em 2 days ago. But if they're tracking me, they could be close." Grady felt a cold weight settle in his gut. A blizzard was bad enough. Unwanted company made it worse. He turned back to the window, staring into the storm. The trees swayed under the wind's fury. The world outside was a swirling white void. But even through the chaos, he felt it. Shift in the air, a sense of something just beyond his sight. Grady's fingers tightened around his revolver. Ezra swallowed hard. Chapter 2. Trouble at the Door. The crunch of boots on ice. Soft but deliberate, they got Ezra no reason to come up here. Breath, eyes wide with fear. Grady didn't answer. Grady moved swiftly, grabbed his rifle from the wall, and pressed his back against the door. Then he heard motioning for Ezra to stay quiet. Outside. Another step, a footstep closer in the snow. Someone was howled, rattling the wooden walls, but Grady had spent too many nights in the wild to mistake the sound. Footsteps. Someone was circling the cabin. He took a slow breath, steadying himself. "You sure they wouldn't come after you?" Ezra didn't answer. His face had gone pale. Grady cursed under his breath. He'd spent months keeping to himself, avoiding trouble, and now, just like that, it had come knocking on his goddamn door. A hand on the latch. Grady didn't hesitate. He spun, throwing his weight against the door just as someone on the other side tried to push it open. The force sent him stumbling back a step, but he caught himself, rifle aimed. The door creaked open just an inch, the wind blasting through the gap. A voice, low and rough. "Monroe!" Grady stiffened. He knew that voice. The door pushed open, and a man stepped inside, snow clinging to his coat, boots caked in ice. He pulled back his hood, revealing a face Grady hadn't seen in years, a face he hadn't wanted to see again. "Been a long time," Boone McAllister said, with a grin. Behind him, 3 more men stepped inside, rifles slung over their shoulders. Their eyes scanned the cabin, taking in Ezra, the fire, the supplies. Grady didn't lower his rifle. "Get the hell out, Boone," Boone chuckled, shaking the snow from his coat. "Now, that ain't much of a welcome, especially considering the business we got to discuss." Grady's grip tightened. "Ain't got no business with you." Boone's grin didn't fade. "See, that's where you're wrong." His gaze flicked to Ezra. "Seems you're harboring a man with a debt to pay." Ezra stiffened. I don't owe you nothing," Boone shrugged. "That so? Then why'd you run?" Grady stepped forward, keeping his rifle steady. "If you got a problem with him, you take it somewhere else." Boone sighed, shaking his head. "You always did like sticking your nose where it didn't belong, Monroe. But I'll tell you what, hand him over, and we'll be on our way. No blood needs spilling tonight." Grady glanced at Ezra. The man was trembling, fists clenched. He didn't know Ezra Crowley, didn't owe him a damn thing, but he knew Boone. And he knew men like him didn't leave loose ends. Grady made his decision in an instant. Go to hell. The room went silent. The fire crackled. Outside, the storm raged on. Boone's hand twitched toward his revolver. Grady fired first. The cabin exploded into chaos. Chapter 3. A cabin full of gunpowder. The deafening crack of Grady's rifle split the air, drowning out the wind's howl. The bullet struck Boone's coat, knocking him back, but the bastard was quick. He twisted just enough to avoid taking the shot clean. Then hell broke loose. Boone's men scattered, overturning a chair as they dove for cover. Ezra yelped and scrambled toward the fireplace, his hands fumbling for anything that could serve as a weapon. Grady didn't have time to reload his rifle. He tossed it aside and drew his Colt Navy revolver, instincts kicking in. The first man to raise his gun caught a bullet in the chest. He let out a wet gasp and staggered back, crashing into a shelf, knocking over tin plates and a lantern. Flames flickered dangerously close to the spilled oil. "Son of a bitch!" Boone roared, ducking behind the table. "Kill him!" Grady dove low as a shot whizzed past his ear. His back hit the wall, heart hammering. He saw Ezra cowering near the fire, clutching a broken chair leg like it was worth a damn. "Get down," Grady barked. Ezra hit the floor just as a bullet tore through the air where his head had been. Another blast, Grady fired again, and the second of Boone's men crumpled, blood staining the wooden floor. The fight had lasted seconds, but it felt like a lifetime. Boone and his last man were still up, and now the fire was spreading. The overturned lantern had shattered, sending flames licking up the cabin wall. Smoke curled toward the ceiling, filling the cramped space with the smell of burning wood and oil. Boone cursed and sprang to his feet, firing wildly as he bolted for the door. His remaining man followed, but Grady put a bullet in his back before he made it out. The outlaw collapsed into the snow outside. Groaning, Grady turned his revolver toward Boone, but the bastard was already halfway down the slope, disappearing into the blizzard. For a second, Grady considered chasing him, ending it right there. Then the flames crackled louder, and the heat roared against his back. Shit! Ezra coughed violently, waving smoke from his face. We gotta go! Grady didn't argue. He holstered his gun, grabbed his rifle, and barreled out the door, Ezra stumbling after him. The cold hit like a hammer. The storm raged on, the wind slicing through their coats like a knife. Snow crunched beneath their boots as they sprinted away from the burning cabin. Behind them, the fire roared, swallowing everything Grady had built. His home, his supplies, his last bit of security. But he didn't stop to watch. They needed to move. Boone was still out there. And now Grady had a price on his head, too. Chapter 4. A Deal with the Devil. They didn't stop running until the flames were just aglow behind them, swallowed by the storm. Ezra collapsed against a fallen log, wheezing. Jesus, we're alive. Grady wasn't feeling as relieved. His cabin was gone. His supplies, his winter rations, all up in smoke, and worse, Boone had gotten away. Grady adjusted his hat, exhaling a cloud of steam into the frigid air. We can't stay here. He'll come back with more men. Ezra rubbed his arms, shivering. Where the hell we supposed to go? Ain't exactly towns nearby Monroe. Grady glanced east toward the barely visible outline of the distant hills. There's a place, he muttered. But we're going to need to move fast, Ezra frowned. What kind of place? Grady didn't answer right away. He was thinking about an old acquaintance, one he wasn't eager to see again, but right now they were out of options. We're heading to Devil's Hollow. Ezra's face went pale. Are you out of your goddamn mind? Grady didn't look at him. He just tightened his coat, adjusted his grip on his rifle, and started walking. Because Devil's Hollow was the last place he wanted to go. But it was the only place left. Chapter 5. Into Devil's Hollow. The storm showed no mercy. The wind ripped through the trees, howling like a wounded beast. Snow clung to Grady's coat, turning his already worn clothes into ice-laden rags. Ezra stumbled behind him, his breath coming in ragged gasps. You really want to go to Devil's Hollow? Ezra panted, barely keeping up. That place is suicide. Grady didn't slow. His eyes stayed locked on the dark hills ahead, where the land dipped into a valley hidden from the outside world. It's the only shot we got, he said simply. Ezra shook his head. You ain't been there in a while, have you? Grady didn't answer. He knew exactly what kind of men ran that place. Smugglers, killers, and outlaws who made their own laws. But there was one man in particular he was thinking about. A man who owed him a favor Grady never wanted to collect. Ezra grabbed his arm, forcing him to stop. Look, I'd rather freeze out here than deal with... A gunshot cracked through the storm. Grady shoved Ezra down just as a second shot whizzed past his shoulder. Down! Stay low! Grady barked, drawing his Colt Navy revolver. He scanned the trees, heart pounding. The snowstorm made it impossible to see more than a few yards ahead. Ezra cowered behind a fallen log. Shit! Who the hell... Another shot. This one slammed into a tree inches from Grady's head. He didn't waste time waiting for another. He fired back, aiming toward the shadowy figures moving in the distance. The storm masked their shapes, but he counted at least 3. Then a voice carried over the wind, rough and cruel. Monroe, you should have stayed dead. Grady's blood ran cold. He knew that voice. Boone, he muttered. Ezra looked at him in horror. He already found us? Another shot rang out. Grady fired back, hitting one of the shadows. A cry of pain followed, and the figure collapsed into the snow. "We need to move," Grady hissed. Ezra didn't argue. He scrambled after Grady as they bolted toward the valley. The gunfire didn't stop. Boone's men kept coming, their bullets tearing through the trees. But the storm worked both ways. Visibility was shit, and Grady used it to his advantage. They ran until the gunshots faded behind them, until the trees thinned, and then, just as suddenly as it had begun, silence. They had reached the outskirts of Devil's Hollow. Chapter 6. The Devil Himself. The hollow was exactly how Grady remembered it, a lawless pit carved into the valley like a scar in the earth. Smoke from hidden fires curled into the night, and the distant sound of drunken laughter carried through the cold. The buildings, if they could even be called that, were little more than shacks and tents, huddled together like rats in a burrow. Ezra whistled low. "Hell of a place." Grady kept moving. "Don't talk, don't look at anyone longer than a second, and don't, for the love of God, draw attention to yourself." Ezra nodded quickly. They walked through the mud-streaked paths, past men wrapped in thick coats, and women eyeing them from dimly lit doorways. Grady felt the weight of every glance, every whisper. They all knew. A stranger had walked into their den. Grady didn't stop until he reached the largest building in the hollow, a 2-story saloon with broken shutters and a faded sign that simply read, "Crow's Roost." Inside, the warmth hit him first. Then the smell, whiskey, sweat, and blood. The place was packed. Men sat hunched over drinks, guns resting on tables. A fight was breaking out in the corner, but no one seemed to care. Grady scanned the room, searching for the one man he had come to see. And then he found him. Malachi Tate. The bastard hadn't changed much, thick, broad-shouldered, with a scar running down his jaw. He leaned against the bar, sipping whiskey like he owned the whole damn place. Grady took a breath and stepped forward. Tate's eyes flicked up, and the second he saw Grady, his expression darkened. "Well, well," Tate drawled. "Look what the storm blew in." Grady stopped a few feet away, his hand resting on his revolver. "I need a favor," he said. Tate smirked. "That's so. Funny, it's 'cause last I checked, you weren't welcome here, Monroe." Ezra shifted uneasily beside him. Grady ignored him. "You owe me, Tate." The saloon went quiet. Men turned to watch. Tate exhaled through his nose, tapping his glass against the bar. "That was a long time ago," Tate said. "Things change." Grady's jaw tightened. "You owe me," he repeated. Tate studied him for a long moment. Then he set his drink down and stood, his boots thudding against the wooden floor. "You come into my place asking for a favor like you still got pull," Tate said, voice dangerously low. "You think that name of yours still means something in the hollow?" Grady didn't flinch. "You know what I did for you, Tate?" Silence. Then laughter. Tate chuckled, shaking his head. "You got balls, Monroe. I'll give you that." Grady stayed quiet, waiting. Finally, Tate sighed. "All right, I'll hear you out." Grady let out a slow breath. He had gotten past the first hurdle, but he knew Tate. Nothing came for free in Devil's Hollow, and before the night was over, Grady was going to regret setting foot in this place. Chapter 7. The price of a favor. Grady knew better than to trust the silence in Devil's Hollow. It wasn't the kind of place where a man could ask for something and walk away without a cost. And Malachi Tate was the last man on earth to do a favor out of the goodness of his heart. Tate leaned against the bar, rubbing a calloused hand over his scarred jaw. "You're in trouble," he finally said. "I can see it plain as day, and you need something from me." Grady didn't move. "I need horses, and I need to get Boone and his men off my back for good." Tate let out a low whistle. "That's a tall order, Monroe." Ezra, who had been silent up until now, cleared his throat nervously. Maybe we should just—" Tate shot him a look. "Who the hell is this?" Grady answered before Ezra could. "He's no one. Just a man Boone wants dead." Tate smirked. Then he ain't no one. He's a damn liability. Grady felt Ezra stiffen beside him, but he didn't argue. He knew better. Tate straightened, adjusting the coat draped over his broad shoulders. You want horses? Fine. You want Boone handled? That's a bit trickier. Grady didn't blink. What do you want in return? Tate grinned. You always were a smart bastard. He turned toward the back of the saloon and motioned for them to follow. Grady hesitated. Every instinct told him this was a mistake, but they were running out of time. Boone wasn't the kind of man to give up easy. With a glance at Ezra, he followed Tate through the saloon's back door. The air behind Crow's Roost was thick with the smell of damp wood and horse sweat. A few men stood near a set of stalls, eyes watching Grady and Ezra with cold calculation. Tate led them toward a fenced-off area where 2 horses stood saddled and ready. You can take these, Tate said, nodding toward the animals. But first, you're going to do something for me. Grady crossed his arms. Spit it out. Tate's grin widened. There's a man here in the hollow. Calls himself Jeremiah Slade. Mean son of a bitch. He's got something of mine, and I want it back. Grady narrowed his eyes. What did he take? Tate's expression darkened. A shipment of gold meant for me. Ezra let out a low whistle. Gold, that's... Tate shot him a look. I wasn't finished. Ezra shut up. Tate turned back to Grady. Slade's holed up in an old barn on the far side of the hollow. I don't care how you do it, but I want that. Gold back. You do that, and I'll give you the horses. And as for Boone... He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. I might just know a way to make sure he never comes after you again. Grady clenched his jaw. Every part of this felt wrong, but they needed those horses, and if there was a way to put Boone in the ground for good... He exhaled slowly. Where's... the barn? Tate smirked. That's the spirit. He pointed past the cluster of buildings that made up the hollow. Down by the river. But be careful, Monroe. Slade ain't the kind to hand over gold with a smile. Grady already knew that. He adjusted his hat, gripping the handle of his revolver. Come on, he muttered to Ezra. Let's get this over with, Ezra groaned. I got a real bad feeling about this. So did Grady, but it was too late to turn back now. Chapter 8. A Barn Full of Trouble. The barn stood alone at the edge of the hollow, its roof sagging under the weight of age and neglect. The only light came from a flickering lantern by the door, casting long shadows against the frost-covered ground. Grady crouched behind a stack of crates, watching. There's at least 4 of them, he murmured. Maybe more inside. Ezra swallowed. And we're supposed to just... what? Walk in and ask nicely for the gold? Grady gave him a flat look. Didn't think so, Ezra muttered. Grady's breath came out in a mist as he reached for his revolver. We go in quiet. Take out whoever we need to. No mess, no noise. Ezra exhaled sharply. Hell, Grady, you make it sound easy. It's not, Grady said simply. They moved carefully, sticking to the shadows. The cold bit at Grady's skin as they crept toward the barn's entrance. He could hear voices inside, low, muttered conversation. A couple of men laughing. Then, the creak of boots on wood. Grady barely had time to react before a guard stepped out from around the barn, rifle in hand. The man's eyes widened in surprise, but Grady was faster. He grabbed the barrel of the rifle, yanking it upward as the man tried to fire. The shot went wild, echoing into the night. Shit! Ezra hissed. Grady drove his elbow into the man's gut, then slammed the butt of his revolver into his temple. The guard crumpled into the snow, but it was too late. Shouts rang out from inside. The barn! Somebody's out there! Get your guns, Grady cursed. So much for quiet. The barn doors burst open and men spilled out, guns drawn. Ezra ducked behind a barrel as bullets ripped through the air. Grady dove for cover, firing back. One of Slade's men went down, clutching his chest. The night exploded into chaos. Grady reloaded, keeping his breathing steady. They had come here for gold, but now they were fighting for their damn lives. Chapter 9. Blood in the Snow. The gunfight was brutal. Grady knew better than to waste bullets, so every shot he took had to count. He fired twice. One man dropped, clutching his gut, while another stumbled back, screaming. But there were too many of them. Ezra, crouched behind the barrel, let out a yelp. "Grady, we're outnumbered!" Grady gritted his teeth. He already knew that. But there was no time for fear, no room for hesitation. He grabbed Ezra by the collar and yanked him toward the side of the barn. "We need cover," Grady barked. Bullets whizzed past as they sprinted toward a broken-down wagon half buried in the snow. Ezra was panting, clutching his side like he had been hit. "You good?" Grady asked. Ezra gasped. "Yeah, just ran out of breath is all." Grady peeked over the wagon, counting heads. 4 men left standing. Slade wasn't among them. He was still inside. A rifle cracked. A bullet punched through the wood beside Grady's head, sending splinters into the air. Ezra cursed. "We gotta get out of here, Grady." Grady ignored him. His eyes flicked to a stack of barrels near the barn doors. Kerosene. An idea struck him. It was reckless, but it might be their only chance. "Ezra," he said, "when I say go, you run for that back door. Get inside. Grab the gold if you see it. I'll cover you." Ezra gaped. "That's your plan? You got a death wish?" "Just do it," Grady snapped. Ezra swallowed hard, nodded. Grady fired twice at the barrels. The first shot missed. The second one hit. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, boom! The explosion rocked the barn, sending fire and smoke into the sky. The men outside staggered back in shock, some diving away from the sudden blaze. "Go!" Grady shouted. Ezra didn't hesitate this time. He darted for the back door, disappearing inside. Grady ducked low, moving through the chaos. He took down another man with a quick shot, then turned toward the barn's entrance. He wasn't leaving without Slade. Inside, the air was thick with smoke. Fire licked at the wooden beams, casting eerie shadows against the walls. Ezra was already rummaging through crates. "Where the hell is it?" Grady scanned the room. There, against the far wall, a locked chest. That had to be it. He moved toward it. A figure stepped from the smoke. Jeremiah Slade. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, with a thick beard and a cold glint in his eye. He had a shotgun in his hands, already aimed. "Should have known Tate'd send someone," Slade growled. Grady didn't stop walking. He kept his voice even. "You got something that don't belong to you, Slade?" Slade smirked. "Depends who you ask." Ezra, still searching, froze when he saw the shotgun. Grady?" "Stay where you are," Grady murmured. Slade cocked the gun. "I ain't afraid to kill Monroe." "Neither am I," Grady said. They stood there, tension thick as the smoke around them. Then Ezra moved. He kicked over a stack of crates, sending them crashing down. Slade flinched just for a second. That was all Grady needed. He lunged forward, knocking the shotgun aside as it went off, the blast tearing through the wall behind him. Slade roared in anger, swinging at Grady with his free hand. Grady ducked, then drove his fist into Slade's gut. The bigger man grunted but didn't go down. He swung again, this time catching Grady across the jaw. Stars burst behind Grady's eyes. Slade reached for a knife at his belt. Ezra panicked. "Grady, move!" Grady recovered just in time to see the blade coming toward him. He twisted away, grabbing Slade's wrist. They struggled, feet slipping against the burning floorboards. Then Grady did the only thing he could. He slammed his forehead into Slade's nose. Crack! Slade howled, staggering back, blood streaming down his face. Grady didn't give him a chance to recover. He grabbed Slade's own knife and drove it deep into the man's side. Slade gasped, eyes wide in shock. He stumbled once, then collapsed to the ground. The barn groaned. The fire was spreading fast. Ezra grabbed the chest. "We gotta go now." Grady didn't argue. He followed Ezra out the back door just as part of the roof caved in behind them. Outside, the hollow was in chaos. People were shouting, trying to put out the fire. Tate's men were already moving in. Tate himself was waiting near the saloon, arms crossed. He grinned when he saw them. "You got it?" Ezra dropped the chest at his feet, panting. "Told you we would." Tate kicked open the lid. Inside, bricks of gold gleamed in the firelight. He chuckled. "Damn, boys, you actually did it." Grady didn't smile. "We held up our end. Now, you hold up yours." Tate nodded. "Fair enough, the horses are yours." He turned to one of his men. "Saddle 'em up." Grady exhaled, tension leaving his body. They had done it, but as he turned, Tate's voice stopped him. "Oh, and about Boone?" Grady frowned. "What about him?" Tate's smirk was slow, deliberate. "Turns out you ain't the only one who wants him dead." Grady's stomach tightened. "What the hell does that mean?" Tate chuckled. "Means I sent word to an old friend of mine, someone Boone's got bad blood with, and let's just say—" He glanced toward the edge of town. "Boone's in for one hell of a surprise." Grady followed his gaze. A lone rider was approaching, silhouetted against the rising sun, and even from a distance, Grady could tell this wasn't just any man. This was someone who wanted Boone dead even more than he did, and that meant things were about to get real. Interesting. Chapter 10. Ghosts from the past. Grady's fingers instinctively tightened around the grip of his revolver as he watched the lone rider approach. The figure moved slow and steady, like a man who wasn't in any hurry, like a man who knew he had already won. Tate chuckled, clearly enjoying Grady's unease. "Recognize him, Monroe?" The closer the rider came, the more familiar he seemed. The way he sat in the saddle, the easy way he held the reins, the cold indifference in his posture. Then the last traces of dawn's light hit his face, and recognition hit Grady like a kick to the gut. No, it couldn't be, but it was. Colum McAllister, a name Grady had hoped never to hear again. Ezra saw the look on his face and frowned. "Who the hell is that?" Grady didn't answer. He didn't need to. Colum McAllister had once been Grady's closest friend. They'd ridden together, fought together, nearly died together more than once. But that was years ago, before Colum had turned into something worse than just an outlaw. Before he had become a legend in all the worst ways. Tate leaned against the saloon's wooden post, smirking. "Figured if anyone could put Boone in the ground, it'd be him." Grady swallowed hard. This was bad. Colum reined his horse to a stop, his boots hitting the dirt with a soft thud as he dismounted. He was tall and lean, his long brown duster battered from years on the trail. A silver revolver rested low on his hip, the handle worn smooth from countless draws. His face was lined with age, but his piercing blue eyes remained unchanged, sharp, unforgiving. "Been a long time, Monroe," Colum said. Grady forced himself to stay still, to keep his expression unreadable. "Not long enough," Colum smirked. "Still, holding grudges, I see." Ezra looked between them. "Okay, am I missing something here? Because I feel like I'm missing something here." Tate chuckled. "Oh, you're missing plenty. These two got history." Colum's eyes flicked to the chest of gold at Tate's feet. "Looks like you finally got yourself a payday." Grady didn't rise to the bait. "What do you want, Colum?" Colum shrugged. "Same as you, I imagine. To see Boone buried." Grady didn't believe that for a second. Boone was a bastard. But Colum? Colum was something else entirely. He never did anything unless it benefited him in the long run. If he was here, it meant one of two things. Either he was after Boone's blood, or he was after something even worse. Grady just didn't know which one yet. The town was stirring. The fire at the hollow had died down, but the scent of smoke still clung to the cold morning air. The streets were muddy from melted snow, and the townsfolk who had dared step outside watched the scene unfold from a safe distance. Tate stretched, letting out a yawn. "Well, as entertaining as this is, I got business to handle. You boys have fun with whatever grudge match this is." He grabbed the chest of gold and gave them a lazy salute before disappearing inside the saloon. Ezra shifted uncomfortably. "Grady, I don't like this." "You don't have to like it," Grady muttered. "Just be ready." Colum chuckled. "Relax, Monroe. I ain't here for you." Grady crossed his arms. "That so? Then why the hell are you here?" Colum's smile faded. "Because Boone killed someone important to me, And I aim to return the favor. Grady studied him, searching for the lie. But for once, Colum looked serious. Who? Colum exhaled, running a hand through his dark hair. My brother, Jace. That made Grady pause. Jace McAllister had been the only person Colum had ever cared about. If Boone had killed him, then this wasn't just a job for Colum. This was personal, and that made things even more dangerous. Where's Boone now? Ezra asked. Colum's jaw tightened. Last I heard, he was holed up in a mining camp about 20 miles west. Place called Bitter Creek. Grady swore under his breath. That's outlaw country, Colum nodded. Damn right it is. And if we don't move fast, Boone's going to hear about what happened in the hollow and vanish before we get there. Ezra groaned. You're saying we got to go in there, into Bitter Creek? Colum smirked. Ain't scared, are you? Ezra scoffed. Scared? No. Just got a healthy respect for places that get men killed. Grady sighed, rubbing a hand down his face. This was insanity. He had what he came for. The gold was theirs. He should take the money, find a way south, and disappear. But he couldn't. Not while Boone was still breathing. Not while Colum was standing in front of him, reminding him of the past he had tried to forget. He looked at Ezra. You don't have to come, Ezra snorted. Like hell I don't. If I let you two go alone, you'll probably kill each other before you even find Boone. Colum grinned. Smart man. Grady sighed. Fine. We ride in an hour. Colum tipped his hat. I'll be ready. As Colum walked away, Ezra leaned in. You sure about this, Grady? Grady watched his old friend disappear into the crowd. No, he admitted, but I don't think we got a choice. Chapter 11. Into the Lion's Den. The road to Bitter Creek was long and treacherous, carved through steep ravines and icy ridges where the wind howled like a pack of wolves. Snow had settled thick on the trail, making each step of their horses a slow, careful process. Grady led the way, his rifle slung across his back, eyes constantly scanning the horizon. Ezra rode beside him, his usual nervous energy dialed up to 10, fingers twitching near the handle of his revolver. Behind them, Colum rode at an easy pace, as if he were out for a Sunday ride instead of heading straight into the jaws of death. Feels like a trap, Ezra muttered under his breath. That's 'cause it probably is, Grady replied. Ezra frowned. Then why the hell are we still riding straight into it? Grady didn't have an answer, not one he liked anyway. Boone had to die, simple as that. He couldn't let 10 bastards slip away again, not after all the blood he'd spilled. And if Colum was telling the truth about his brother, then at least they had a common enemy. Colum whistled a lazy tune. You boys always this talkative? Ezra shot him a look. Some of us don't like marching head first into death, McAllister. Colum grinned. Well, lucky for you, I got a plan. Grady glanced back. At him. That right? Mind sharing? Colum leaned forward in his saddle. Bitter Creek's run by a gang called the Red Knives. Mean bastards. But they ain't Boone's men. If we're careful, we can use that, Ezra scoffed. Oh, sure. Walk right into a camp full of cutthroats and hope they let us take Boone? That's the plan? Colum shrugged. Not much of a thinker, are you? Ezra bristled. Grady cut in. Keep talking, Colum smirked. The Red Knives don't like Boone much. Word is he double-crossed him a few months back. If we play this right, we might be able to turn him against him. Ezra rubbed his temples. So, let me get this straight. You want to walk into a camp full of killers and convince them to kill another killer for us? That about sum it up? Colum nodded. See? You're getting it. Ezra let out a frustrated sigh. Oh, we're all gonna die. Grady exhaled slowly. The plan was reckless, but it had a sliver of logic. If they tried to take Boone alone, they'd be dead before they got close. But if they could stir the pot, set his enemies against him, it might just work, if they didn't get their throats cut first. By nightfall, the lights of Bitter Creek flickered in the valley below. A mining camp turned outlaw refuge. It was a cluster of ramshackle buildings and tents, the whole place built into the side of a frozen cliff. Fires burned in steel barrels, casting long shadows across the snow. Figures moved between the buildings armed. Men watching the road. Ezra swallowed. I really don't like this. Grady adjusted his hat. Then stay close and keep your mouth shut, Colum grinned. Oh, this'll be fun. They rode in slow, making sure not to look like a threat. The moment they reached the outskirts, a group of men stepped forward, rifles raised. That's far enough. One of them growled. He was a tall man with a thick beard, a scar running down the left side of his face. State your business. Colum raised his hands, all charm. Ain't looking for trouble, friend. Just got some news about Boone. Scarface narrowed his eyes. Boone? Colum nodded. Yeah. Word is, he's hiding out in your backyard. The men exchanged glances. Boone wasn't welcome here. That much was clear. Scarface lowered his rifle just slightly. And what's that news worth to you? Colum grinned. How about a trade? You help us, we help you. Scarface studied them for a long moment, then nodded toward the town. Come with me. Ezra let out a breath. Well, guess we're doing this. Grady nudged his horse forward, keeping his hand close to his gun. One way or another, this was going to end tonight. Chapter 12. A Deal with the Devil. The inside of the Red Knives hideout was exactly what Grady expected. Dimly lit, smoky, and thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and stale whiskey. The men inside looked up as they entered, hands twitching near weapons, eyes narrowing at the unfamiliar faces. Scarface led them through the room, past tables where men gambled with gold, dust and bottles of stolen liquor. A few watched them with open curiosity, while others barely spared them a glance, too focused on their cards or drinks. At the back of the room, seated at a table covered in maps and bullet-ridden wanted posters, was a man who could only be their leader. He was older than the rest, with graying hair tied back into a rough ponytail and deep scars running across his knuckles. His coat was worn but well kept, the revolver at his hip polished to a gleaming shine. His eyes, sharp and calculating, flicked up to meet theirs as Scarface stopped before the table. "Boss," Scarface said, "they got news about Boone." The leader leaned back, folding his arms across his chest. "That's so." His voice was slow and even, like a man who never had to raise it to be obeyed. He studied them for a long moment before his gaze settled on Colum. "And who the hell are you?" Colum smirked. "Just a man with a proposition." The leader didn't return the smile. "You got a name, or do I have to guess?" Colum spread his hands. "Colum McAllister. Maybe you heard of me." The leader raised an eyebrow. "Can't say I have." Ezra let out a quiet chuckle, earning a sharp glare from Colum. Grady stepped forward. "We're here 'cause we got a common enemy." The leader looked him up and down. "And you are Grady Monroe." That name seemed to mean something. The leader's expression shifted just slightly, but it was enough. "Monroe, huh? Heard you got a reputation up north. Word is, you don't play well with others." Grady shrugged. "Ain't looking for friends, just want Boone dead." The leader studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Well now, that's something we might agree on." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Name's Warren Tate. I run things here in Bitter Creek." "And Boone?" His expression darkened. "That bastard's been a thorn in my side for months." Colum sat down across from him. "Then maybe we can help each other out." Tate tapped his fingers against the table. "I'm listening." Colum grinned. "Boone's holed up not far from here, right? You want him dead. We want him dead. Seems like a good time to make a deal." Tate tilted his head. "And what exactly are you offering?" Grady spoke up. "We know where he is. We'll help you take him down." Tate let out a dry chuckle. "And what do you get?" His head. "On a spike," Grady said flatly. Ezra muttered under his breath. "And hopefully we don't die doing it." Tate considered them for a long moment, then finally nodded. "All right, you bring me Boone, and we'll call it even." Colum grinned. "Now that's more like it." Tate held up a hand. But understand something, if you're lying to me, or if this is some kind of trick, you won't leave Bitter Creek alive." Grady met his gaze without flinching. "Wouldn't expect any different," Tate smirked. "Then we got ourselves a deal." He stood, grabbing his rifle. "Boys, saddle up. We're going to pay Boone a visit." The room stirred with movement as men grabbed their weapons, checking their ammo and strapping on extra knives. Ezra leaned toward Grady. "I got a real bad feeling about this." Grady adjusted his hat. "You always got a bad feeling." Ezra scoffed. "Yeah, and I'm usually right." Grady exhaled slowly, watching as the Red Knives prepared for war. One way or another, this was going to be the end of Boone or the end of them. The storm outside raged on, but inside the cabin, the real danger had just begun. Grady Monroe's grip on his revolver remained firm, his finger hovering over the trigger as Boone and his men stepped further into the cabin. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows over their hard, weathered faces. Snow clung to their coats, melting into dark patches of dampness. Boone's grin never wavered as he took another step forward, his boots heavy against the wooden floor. "You still thinking about using that gun, Monroe?" Boone asked, tilting his head. "'Cause if you are, I'd think real hard about how fast you reckon you are against 4 men." Ezra Crowley swallowed audibly, pressing himself deeper into the chair by the fire. His hands twitched at his sides, the nerves in his face drawn tight. He looked like a cornered rabbit, and in truth, he was. Grady's eyes darted between the men. Boone was the clear leader, but the others weren't just muscle. The one to his left, a wiry man with a scar running down his cheek, had the look of a knife fighter, quick, precise, deadly. Another, bulkier and broad-shouldered, had the dead stare of a man who had taken more lives than he cared to count. The last one, younger, maybe in his early 20s, had eager, hungry eyes that lingered too long on Grady's pack of supplies near the door. They weren't just here for Ezra. They'd take whatever they could carry, and if that meant leaving corpses behind, so be it. "Ezra," Boone said, turning his attention to the trembling man, "you gave us a real chase. Thought you were clever running off into the storm. Thought maybe you'd freeze to death, and we wouldn't have to do the dirty work ourselves." His grin widened. "But you got lucky, didn't you? Found yourself a savior." Ezra didn't speak. He barely breathed. Boone's eyes flicked back to Grady. "Now, we ain't unreasonable men, Monroe. You know that. Hand him over, and we'll leave you be." Grady exhaled slowly. His instinct screamed at him to play it smart, to let them take Ezra and be done with it. It wasn't his fight. He owed the men nothing. But something about Boone's tone, about the way his men stood, ready, coiled, waiting, told Grady that letting them have Ezra wouldn't be the end of it. They'd kill him anyway. Maybe they'd kill Grady too, just to tie up loose ends. And Grady Monroe didn't survive this long by letting men like Boone decide his fate. "I don't like the way you're asking," Grady finally said, his voice calm, measured. Boone's smile faltered. "Just a flicker." "Ain't a request, Monroe." Grady's jaw tightened. "Then you best get to it." Silence stretched between them, taut as a tripwire. Boone's fingers twitched toward the revolver on his hip, and then the firelight flashed against metal. Grady moved first. His Colt Navy roared in the small cabin, the gunshot deafening. Boone stumbled back, cursing, his hand snapping up to clutch his shoulder, where the bullet tore through his coat. The other 3 men sprang into action. Scarface lunged to the left. The bulky one drew a sawed-off shotgun, and the younger one fumbled for his pistol. Grady didn't give them the chance. He dove to the side, knocking over a wooden chair as another gunshot exploded in the room. Ezra yelped, scrambling out of the way, as a bullet splintered the wall where his head had been moments before. Smoke filled the air, mixing with the acrid scent of burnt powder. Scarface rushed forward, a gleaming knife in his grip. Grady barely had time to block, his forearm catching the man's wrist before the blade could bury itself in his gut. They struggled, boots scraping against the wooden floor, before Grady drove his knee up into Scarface's ribs. The man grunted, stumbling back, but not before raking his knife across Grady's coat, slicing through the fabric. A shotgun blast tore through the cabin. Wood shattered. Sparks flew as the fireplace was hit, sending embers scattering across the floor. Grady hit the ground hard, rolling behind the overturned chair just as another shot rang out. Ezra, to his credit, wasn't completely useless. The younger outlaw let out a strangled gasp, dropping his pistol as he clutched at his thigh. Blood seeped through his pants where Ezra had somehow managed to get a shot off. The kid went down, howling. Grady took the opening. His revolver kicked in his grip as he fired again. Scarface jerked back, a hole appearing in his chest before he collapsed. The big one with the shotgun cursed, fumbling to reload. No time. Grady surged forward, closing the distance in 2 long strides. He grabbed the shotgun barrel, wrenching it upward just as the trigger was pulled. The shot went wild, punching a hole through the roof. Before the man could react, Grady drove his revolver's barrel into his gut and pulled the trigger. The man crumpled. That left Boone. Grady turned just in time to see the outlaw leader staggering toward the door, clutching his wounded shoulder. Their eyes met. Boone hesitated. Then, with a snarl, he threw himself outside into the storm. Grady didn't chase him. Instead, he stood there, chest rising and falling, gun still clutched in his hand. Smoke curled from the barrel. The cabin was in shambles. Furniture overturned, the fire sputtering, the smell of blood thick in the air. Ezra slumped against the wall, panting. Jesus Christ. Grady exhaled sharply, holstering his gun. You all right? Ezra let out a breathless laugh, shaky and disbelieving. I think so. Grady nodded. His gaze shifted to the door where Boone had vanished into the storm. He wasn't dead, and that was going to be a problem. Grady didn't like loose ends. Not in a place like this, and certainly not with a man like Boone. The storm swallowed Boone whole, his figure vanishing into the swirling white void. But Grady knew better than to think the man was gone for good. Boone was wounded, humiliated, and furious. He'd be back, and next time he wouldn't come knocking. Grady holstered his revolver and exhaled slowly, his breath still steady, despite the adrenaline surging through his veins. He took a quick glance around the cabin. It was a mess. Blood smeared across the floorboards, broken furniture scattered across the room, and a gaping hole in the ceiling where the shotgun blast had torn through the wood. The fire in the hearth was barely more than embers now. Fighting. Against the chill that seeped in from outside, Ezra let out a shaky breath from where he was slumped against the wall. His face was pale, his hands still trembling. He looked up at Grady, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. That was... Ezra swallowed, trying to find his voice. That was damn near the end of us, wasn't it? Grady didn't answer immediately. He walked over to the young outlaw, the one Ezra had shot in the leg. The kid was still alive, barely conscious, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. Blood pooled around him, soaking into the floor. Grady knelt beside him, gripping the front of his coat. What's your name? The kid's eyes fluttered open, glassy with pain. Tommy, he croaked. How many more of you are out there, Tommy? Grady's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. Tommy coughed weakly, his body shivering from more than just the cold. Just Boone, he rasped. He won't stop. You know that. Grady stared at him for a long moment before releasing his grip. Tommy slumped back with a pained groan. He was done for. Even if he made it through the night, his leg was ruined, and in these mountains, a man who couldn't walk was as good as dead. Grady stood, turning back to Ezra. We need to move. Ezra blinked. Move? In this storm? Boone's coming back, Grady said simply, already grabbing supplies. And he won't be alone next time. Ezra hesitated, then nodded, forcing himself to his feet. He was still shaken, but there was a new kind of resolve in his eyes. He knew what was at stake now. Grady grabbed his pack, throwing extra rounds into his belt, making sure his rifle was loaded. He'd survived worse than this before, but something told him that Boone wasn't the kind of man to let a grudge go easily, and in the lawless, frozen wilderness of these mountains, A grudge could mean death. Grady threw a heavy coat over his shoulders and fastened the straps of his pack. The storm outside had not relented. It howled with a fury that made stepping into it seem like a death sentence, but staying here was worse. Ezra pulled on his own coat, still wincing from the fight. Where the hell are we even going to go? Grady checked the rounds in his revolver before sliding it back into the holster. There's an old trapping cabin about 5 miles west. Built it myself a couple years back. No one knows about it but me. Ezra's brows shot up. 5 miles? In this? He gestured to the blizzard raging outside. Grady's expression was hard as stone. You'd rather wait here? For Boone? Ezra clamped his mouth shut. Grady shouldered his pack and moved to the door, pausing, only to glance at the wounded outlaw on the floor. Tommy was barely holding on, his breath weak and labored. Ezra hesitated. What about him? Grady didn't look at him when he answered. He made his choice. Without another word, he pulled open the door, letting in a blast of ice and snow. Ezra flinched, then followed, leaving the dying man behind. The cold was worse than Grady had expected. It was the kind of cold that burned, that numbed your fingers within minutes and gnawed at your bones. The wind carried the sting of ice, lashing at his exposed skin like 1,000 tiny knives. Ezra was already struggling after the first mile, his boots slipping in the deep snow. He muttered curses under his breath, shivering violently. "This is suicide," he growled. "Boone doesn't have to kill us. The damn cold will do it for him." Grady didn't slow. "Keep moving." Ezra let out a frustrated sigh, but obeyed, trudging. Forward through the knee-deep drifts, the snow muffled everything, swallowing their footsteps and making the world eerily silent. But Grady's instincts never slept. He kept his rifle in hand, his ears tuned to anything that didn't belong. After another mile, something shifted in his gut. He stopped. Ezra nearly bumped into him. "What?" Grady raised a hand. "Listen." Ezra froze, holding his breath. At first there was nothing, just the wind howling through the pines. But then, there, a faint crunch in the distance. Grady's grip tightened on his rifle. "We're not alone." Ezra's face paled. "You think it's Boone?" Grady didn't answer. Instead, he gestured for Ezra to move. Faster this time, they pressed on, their pace quickening, despite the cold sapping their strength. The sounds followed. Them, footsteps, careful, measured, tracking them through the storm. Whoever it was, they weren't in a hurry. They knew what they were doing, and that made them dangerous. Grady clenched his jaw. This wasn't some lost traveler stumbling through the storm. This was a hunter, a patient one. Ezra was breathing hard, his face half hidden behind the scarf wrapped around his mouth. "Tell me you got a plan," he whispered. Grady glanced around. The forest was thickening up ahead, the towering pines offering a break from the worst of the wind. If they could make it there, they'd have cover, maybe even a chance to lose whoever was following them. "We get to the trees," Grady murmured. "Then we disappear." Ezra swallowed hard, but nodded. Together they pushed forward, each step a battle against the waist-deep drift. The wind howled, covering their tracks almost as fast as they made them. Then another sound, a whistle, sharp, deliberate, cutting through the storm like a blade. Grady stopped dead in his tracks. Ezra stiffened. "What the hell was that?" Grady didn't answer. He knew that sound. It was a signal. A few seconds later, another whistle answered from somewhere ahead. They were being flanked. Grady's pulse pounded in his ears. Boone's men had found them faster than he'd hoped. Ezra cursed. "Shit, we're walking right into ain't we?" Grady's mind raced. Running blind into the trees was a gamble now. They had no idea how many were waiting for them, but staying out in the open was suicide. Then he saw it. To the left, a rocky outcrop jutted from the hillside, half buried in snow. The wind had carved out a hollow beneath it, a natural shelter, small but deep enough to hide in. Grady pointed. "There! Move!" They lunged toward it, fighting against the snow, their legs burning with effort. Grady shoved Ezra inside first, then crawled in after him, pulling his rifle close. They pressed against the icy rock, holding their breath. Silence. Then footsteps. Close. Grady risked a glance out. A figure moved through the storm, barely visible through the swirling white. A dark shape, wrapped in furs, rifle slung across his back. He moved slow, deliberate, scanning the snow for tracks. Another shape appeared beside him, then another. 3 of them. Grady's grip tightened on his gun. Ezra didn't dare breathe. The men stopped just a few yards away. "Tracks end here," one of them muttered. Another voice, deeper. They didn't just vanish. The 3rd man, taller, broader, stepped forward. Even through the storm, Grady recognized the coat. Boone. Boone knelt, brushing a gloved hand over the snow. He turned his head slightly, scanning the landscape. Grady could see the glint of his revolver at his hip. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Boone straightened. "They're close," he murmured. "Real close." Ezra's fingers twitched toward his pistol. Grady shot him a look. Not yet. Boone turned to his men. "Spread out. Flush 'em out." The men fanned out, disappearing into the storm. Grady exhaled slowly. Ezra's voice was barely a whisper. "What do we do?" Grady's eyes were locked on Boone, still standing just feet away. A plan was forming, a risky one. He looked at Ezra, voice low and steady. "We take 'em before they take us." Grady's mind worked fast. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped. But they still had the element of surprise. Ezra shifted beside him, his breath ragged. "You sure about this?" "No." Grady's grip on his rifle tightened. "But we don't have a choice." Boone was still standing just outside their hiding spot, scanning the tree line. His men were moving outward, searching. In less than a minute, one of them would stumble across the outcrop. Grady exhaled. "When I say go, you take the one on the left. I'll handle Boone." Ezra swallowed, nodding. Grady's heartbeat slowed. He lined up the shot. Then, now. A gunshot rang out. The crack of the gunshot shattered the stillness of the frozen night. Boone's men barely had time to react before chaos erupted. Ezra's bullet struck the man on the left, sending him stumbling backward into the snow with a choked gasp. Grady's shot was faster, cleaner. Boone barely flinched before the force of the bullet slammed him into the side of a tree. "Damn it!" one of the remaining men yelled, ducking behind a snow-covered log. "They're shooting back?" "No kidding," Ezra muttered, reloading with shaking fingers. Grady ignored him, his eyes locked onto the last 2 bandits. They were scrambling for cover, trying to get a better angle. If he didn't move now, they'd be pinned down. "Stay low," he murmured to Ezra, before shifting to the right. The cold bit into his fingers as he gripped the rifle tighter, crawling through the snow. Another shot rang out, too close. A bullet chipped a chunk of wood from the log he was using as cover. Grady cursed, rolling to the side, just as another shot buried itself in the snow where he had just been. The bastards were smart, but he was smarter. He steadied himself, took a deep breath, and fired. A sharp cry echoed through the woods. One more down. The last man hesitated, his gun wavering. The fight had shifted. He wasn't hunting anymore. He was being hunted. Grady stepped forward, his rifle still raised. "Drop it." The bandit's breath came fast and shallow, his eyes darting toward Boone's still form in the snow. "Ain't worth dying for," he muttered, before tossing his gun aside. Grady didn't look away as Ezra picked up the discarded weapon. "Smart choice," Grady said. The wind howled through the trees as silence settled over the battlefield. The bodies lay still, their blood seeping into the snow, turning it dark. Ezra let out a shaky breath. "We ain't dead." "Not yet," Grady muttered. He glanced down at Boone, his lips pressing into a thin line. Boone coughed weakly, blood trickling from his mouth. "You should have stayed hidden," he rasped. Grady crouched beside him, eyes cold. "And let you bring hell to my doorstep?" Boone chuckled, though it turned into a wet, ragged cough. "It ain't over." Grady's jaw tightened. He stood lifting his rifle once more. Ezra hesitated. "You sure about this?" Grady didn't answer. The shot rang out, and Boone's body went still. The storm raged on, and Grady Monroe knew there was more blood yet to be spilled. The storm howled through the trees, the wind cutting like a blade against Grady's exposed skin. The bodies of Boone and his men lay still in the snow, their lifeblood steaming in the freezing air. But there was no time to dwell on them. Ezra let out a long breath and shook his head. Damn, didn't think I'd see another sunrise. Grady ignored him, already moving toward Boone's corpse. He crouched down and began searching the dead man's pockets, fingers numb from the cold. He found a few gold coins, a hunting knife, and most importantly, a folded piece of paper. What's that? Ezra asked, peering over his shoulder. Grady unfolded it, his eyes scanning the words. It was a crude map drawn in charcoal, leading to something in the mountains. There was a mark not too far from their current location, and next to it, scrawled in a shaky hand, were the words, "The cache." Ezra whistled. That looks important, Grady grunted. Maybe not. But deep down he knew it meant trouble. Ezra eyed the bodies. We leaving 'em here? Grady stood, shoving the map into his coat. Storm'll take care of 'em? Ezra nodded and followed as Grady made his way back toward the cabin. The wind had picked up, sending fresh waves of snow across the ground, already starting to cover the blood. By morning, there would be nothing left but cold, silent ghosts. The cabin felt smaller after the fight, the air inside thick with gunpowder and sweat. Grady set his rifle down and leaned against the table, rubbing his temples. Ezra, meanwhile, was rummaging through the supplies. "What the hell are you doing?" Grady asked. "Checking what we got," Ezra said, holding up a tin of dried beans. "We should pack up and get the hell out of here," Grady frowned. "You're free to go. I ain't stopping you." Ezra hesitated. "You're staying?" Grady exhaled slowly. "Got things to do." Ezra's eyes drifted to the pocket where Grady had stashed the map. "It's that mark on the map, ain't it? Whatever Boone was after." Grady didn't respond. Ezra grinned. "You're thinking of going after it." Grady finally met his gaze. "I ain't thinking about it. I am going after it." Ezra shook his head with a chuckle. "You got a death wish, friend." Grady's expression remained cold. "I got reasons," Ezra sighed, tossing the can of beans onto the table. "Well, hell, guess I'd be a fool to let you go alone." Grady arched an eyebrow. "You saying you're coming with me?" Ezra smirked. "I ain't got nowhere else to be." Grady studied him for a moment before nodding. "Then we leave at first light." Outside, the wind screamed against the walls, but inside Grady's mind was already moving forward, toward the map. Toward the unknown, and, most likely, toward more blood. Morning came slowly, the first weak rays of sunlight barely cutting through the heavy clouds. The storm had calmed, leaving behind a world of white. Boone and his men were buried beneath the fresh snowfall, their bodies erased by nature's hand. Grady tightened the straps on his pack and secured his rifle. Ezra stood beside him, shifting from foot to foot, rubbing his hands together for warmth. "You sure about this?" Ezra asked, nodding toward the map in Grady's pocket. Grady pulled it out again, eyes scanning the rough lines and markings. "Boone thought it was worth dying for. That means it's worth looking into." Ezra sighed. "Yeah, well, so was gold, and look how that turned out for most men." Grady didn't argue. He just adjusted the revolver on his hip and started walking. The journey into the mountains was brutal. The snow was deep, the cold unforgiving. Their breath came out in thick clouds as they pushed forward, each step an effort. By midday, they reached a narrow ravine, the sheer rock walls rising high on either side. The map indicated the mark was just beyond it. Ezra scanned the cliffs warily. "This looks like a perfect place for an ambush," Grady nodded. "Stay sharp." They moved cautiously, their boots crunching over the ice-covered ground. The silence was unsettling, broken only by the occasional crack of ice shifting under the weight of the snow. Then, a gunshot echoed through the ravine. Grady and Ezra dove for cover as a bullet shattered a rock inches from Grady's head. "Phantom of a..." Ezra cursed, drawing his pistol. Grady peered over the edge of a boulder, his eyes scanning the cliffs. A shadow moved above, more than one. Looks like Boone wasn't the only one after this, Grady muttered. Another shot rang out, striking the ground between them. Ezra fired back. We gotta move, or we're sitting ducks. Grady's mind raced. They were exposed, outnumbered, and running low on options. And the worst part? They still didn't even know what they were fighting for. The air was thick with gunpowder and the sharp scent of ice. Bullets chipped away at the rocks around them as Grady and Ezra pressed themselves against the frozen ground. Grady's mind worked fast. They couldn't stay here. Whoever was up there had the advantage. We move on my mark, he said, reloading his revolver. You go left, I'll cover you. Ezra swallowed hard but nodded. Just don't let me die out here. Grady smirked grimly. Not today. He counted down in his head. 3, 2, 1, go. Ezra darted left, slipping through the snow, his body low. Grady popped up and fired, his bullets forcing their attackers to duck. He caught a glimpse of them, 2, maybe 3 men, bundled in furs, their rifles braced against the rocks. A sharp pain burned across Grady's shoulder as a bullet grazed him, but he didn't stop. He moved, zigzagging between boulders until he reached a better position. Ezra fired, and one of the men above let out a sharp cry, tumbling down the slope. Got up. One! Ezra yelled. Grady aimed at another, squeezing the trigger. The man flinched, clutching his side, then disappeared behind the ridge. Silence followed, save for the wind whistling through the ravine. Grady's breathing was heavy, but steady. That all of 'em? Ezra crept forward, his pistol still raised. Shadow moved above. Grady saw it too late. A figure leapt from the ridge, tackling Ezra into the snow. A knife gleamed in the morning light as it slashed downward. Ezra barely caught the man's wrist, struggling against the weight pressing down. On him! Grady surged forward, grabbing the attacker by the collar and yanking him back. They tumbled into the snow, wrestling for control. The man was strong, desperate. His teeth were yellowed, his breath rank with whiskey and rot. You don't know what you're messing with, he snarled, clawing at Grady's face. Grady twisted, bringing his knee up hard into the man's stomach. The attacker wheezed, but kept fighting. Ezra staggered up, his pistol shaking in his hands. Grady, move! Grady rolled just as Ezra fired. The shot rang out. The man jerked, then slumped, his body going still. Ezra exhaled sharply, lowering the gun. Shit! Shit! Grady wiped blood from his lip and pushed himself up. His shoulder ached from the earlier wound, but he ignored it. He turned to their fallen enemies, searching their bodies. That's when he found it. A map, similar to Boone's, but with different markings. Ezra looked over his shoulder. What the hell is that? Grady studied it, his expression darkening. Trouble, because this map didn't lead to gold. It led to something worse. Grady's grip on his revolver remained steady as Boone and his men stepped further inside, shaking off the snow. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows over their rugged faces. The scent of damp leather and gun oil filled the air, mixing with the bitter cold that seeped through the open door. Ezra stiffened beside the fire, his breath shallow. He looked like a trapped animal, eyes darting from Boone to Grady, searching for some kind of escape. But there was none. Not unless Grady made one. Boone smirked, his lips curling under his thick beard. Ain't seen you in a long time, Monroe. Thought you might have run back east with your tail between your legs. Grady didn't take the bait. He knew Boone too well. Every word was a test, every grin hiding a blade. Didn't have a reason. To leave, Grady said, voice level. Still don't, Boone chuckled, glancing at his men. You hear that, boys? Monroe here thinks he's got himself a nice little hideaway, like the world just forgot about him. One of the men, a wiry bastard with a scar running down his cheek, snorted. Ain't nobody gets to disappear, not out here. Ezra swallowed hard. Look, Boone, whatever it is you think I did, Boone's boot lashed out, kicking over a small table, sending tin plates clattering across the floor. Ezra flinched. What you did, Boone said slowly, stepping closer, was steal from us, and men don't steal from me. Ezra raised his hands. I didn't steal. I won fair and square. You boys just didn't like losing. Boone tilted his head. That's so. He turned to Grady. What do you think, Monroe? You believe in fair and square? Grady's jaw tightened. He knew this wasn't just about Ezra. Boone was feeling him out, testing whether he'd stand aside or get in the way. If he cheated you, Grady said carefully, then deal with him, outside, Boone smirked. That a fact? Grady didn't blink. Ain't no blood getting spilled in my cabin. Boone exhaled sharply through his nose, considering. Then, in a blur of movement, he swung the butt of his rifle, fast and hard. Grady ducked. The wooden stock whistled past his head. In the same breath, he slammed his shoulder into Boone, sending them both crashing into the table. Boone cursed, struggling, but Grady's knee was already in his gut, knocking the air from his lungs. Then, the gunshot started. Ezra had lunged for the fireplace, grabbing a burning log and swinging it wildly. The flame caught the wiry man's coat, sending him staggering back with a scream. Another of Boone's men drew his revolver. Too slow. Grady's Colt barked, and the man crumpled against the cabin wall, blood painting the wood. Boone roared, twisting free, his fist slamming into Grady's ribs. Pain exploded through him, but he didn't let go of his gun. He fired again. Click. Empty. Boone grinned. Should have reloaded. Grady barely had time to move before Boone tackled him, both of them crashing through the cabin door into the snow. The cold bit deep as they rolled, fists flying. Boone was stronger, but Grady was faster. He dodged a wild punch and drove his elbow into Boone's jaw, snapping his head back. Ezra! Grady shouted. Inside the cabin, Ezra was scrambling. He grabbed the dead man's revolver, fumbling with the hammer. Boone's knee caught Grady's side, knocking the wind from his lungs. The bigger man rolled on top of him, pinning him down. You always were a stubborn son of a bitch, Boone snarled, pressing a knife to Grady's throat. Should have kept your nose out of... The gunshot echoed through the mountains. Boone went stiff. His mouth opened, but no sound came. A dark stain spread across his chest. He slumped sideways, falling into the snow. Ezra stood in the doorway, gun shaking in his grip. Smoke curled from the barrel. For a long moment, there was only the wind. Grady pushed Boone's body off him, chest heaving. He looked up at Ezra, then at the two remaining men. One was groaning, clutching his wounded arm. The other was still burning, flailing in the snow. Take your wounded and go, Grady said, voice raw. The scarred man hesitated. Then, without a word, he grabbed his injured partner and staggered into the storm, leaving Boone's corpse behind. Grady pushed himself to his feet. His ribs ached, his breath ragged. He turned to Ezra. You should have run when you had the chance. Ezra exhaled shakily. I know. Grady stared at Boone's body, at the blood soaking into the snow. The past had finally caught up to him, and now there was no running from it. Grady wiped a trail of blood from his lip, staring down at Boone's lifeless body. The storm howled around them, as if the mountains themselves were mourning, or perhaps celebrating the death of another outlaw. The bitter wind bit through his coat, but he barely felt it. His mind was already running through the consequences of what had just happened. Ezra stood frozen in the doorway, the gun still clutched in his trembling hands. His face was pale, his breath uneven. Grady stepped closer, prying the revolver from Ezra's grip. You ever kill a man before? Ezra swallowed hard, his gaze locked on Boone's body. No, Grady sighed. He had seen this before, men who thought they understood the cost of survival until they pulled the trigger. Ezra might have saved them both, but the weight of what he had done would stay with him. Come on, Grady said. We can't stay here. Ezra snapped out of his daze. What? Why? They're gone? For now. Grady holstered his Colt and stepped back inside the cabin. They'll be back. Maybe not tonight, maybe not tomorrow. But men like that don't let things go. Ezra hesitated before stepping inside as well. The cabin felt different now, tainted by blood and violence. The fire flickered, casting long shadows across the wooden walls. The place had been his refuge, his hiding place. Now it was just another battleground. Grady grabbed his pack, shoving supplies inside with practiced speed. You got anything worth taking, grab it. Ezra's eyes darted around. Where are we going? West, Grady said. Deeper into the mountains. No one will follow us through a storm like this. Ezra hesitated. What if they do? Grady tightened the straps on his pack. Then we make sure they don't leave alive. Ezra's face paled even more, but he nodded. He had no other choice. The wind shrieked outside as they prepared to leave. Grady took one last look around the cabin. He had spent months building this place, hoping to carve out a sliver of peace in a world that refused to give it. Now, it was nothing more than another grave. Without another word, they stepped out into the storm, leaving Boone's body behind. The snow would bury him soon enough, and by the time it melted, Grady Monroe would either be far away or dead. The wind roared through the trees, drowning out all sound except for the crunch of boots against the ice-packed ground. Snow swirled violently in the air, cutting visibility down to almost nothing. Grady pulled his coat tighter around him, feeling the sting of cold bite through the fabric. Ezra trailed just a few steps behind, struggling to keep up. Move faster, Grady muttered. We stop too long, we freeze. Ezra gritted his teeth, gripping his pack tighter as he trudged. Forward. The storm was relentless, a blinding fury that erased all landmarks, making the landscape feel like an endless white void. Grady knew these mountains well. He had spent months studying their ridges, their hidden valleys, their safest paths. But even he wouldn't last long in a storm like this. They needed shelter. He pushed forward, leading Ezra along a narrow path between two towering rock formations. The wind funneled through the gap, howling like a living thing. Somewhere in the back of his mind, Grady recalled an old legend the trappers used to tell about spirits that haunted the mountains, leading lost men to their deaths. He had never been one for superstition, but tonight the thought unsettled him more than he cared to admit. After what felt like hours, they reached a cluster of trees at the base of a steep hill. Grady knew what was on the other side, a narrow canyon, and within it, an old, abandoned trapper's cabin. Almost there, he called back to Ezra. Ezra didn't respond. When Grady turned, he saw the younger man hunched over, breath heaving, his body swaying slightly. His face was pale beneath the layers of snow clinging to his beard. Grady cursed and grabbed his arm. "Stay with me." Ezra nodded weakly, his steps unsteady. He was half frozen, running on nothing but adrenaline and fear. If they didn't get inside soon, he wouldn't make it. Grady forced them forward, pushing through the knee-deep snow. The canyon's entrance was barely visible in the storm, but he knew they were close. His mind calculated their next moves. Get inside, start a fire, warm Ezra up before he lost consciousness. Then he saw it. The cabin. It was barely standing. Its roof sagged under the weight of years of neglect, and the door hung slightly off its hinges. But the walls were still up. That was all that mattered. Grady shoved the door open with his shoulder, sending a cascade of snow falling from the frame. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the faint, lingering scent of old smoke. It had been a long time since anyone stayed here. He pulled Ezra inside, kicking the door shut against the wind. Ezra collapsed onto the floor, shivering violently. Grady moved fast. He stripped off his gloves and dug through his pack, pulling out. His flint and steel, his fingers were numb, but he forced them to work, striking spark after spark into the cold hearth. The fire was slow to take, but after a few agonizing moments, the kindling caught. Flames flickered to life, weak at first, then stronger, as Grady fed them more wood. The warmth spread through the tiny cabin, chasing away the bitter cold. Grady turned to Ezra, who was curled near the fire, his breath coming in short gasps. "You still with me?" Grady asked. Ezra nodded weakly. "Yeah, barely." Grady sat back, running a hand down his face. They had made it through the worst of the storm, but trouble was far from over. Somewhere out in the blizzard, Boone's men were still searching, and when the storm passed, they would come hunting. The storm raged on through the night, rattling the cabin walls like an angry beast trying to claw its way inside. The fire crackled steadily, casting flickering shadows across the rough wooden floor. Grady sat with his back against the wall, his rifle resting across his lap. His eyes remained fixed on the door. He knew better than to let his guard down. Ezra stirred beside the fire, his body still racked with occasional shivers. He had managed to doze off, exhaustion and cold finally dragging him into uneasy sleep. Grady envied him for that. For hours he listened. The wind howled. The wooden beams groaned. But beneath it all, he heard nothing else. Maybe Boone and his men had lost their trail. Maybe the storm had swallowed them whole. Or maybe they were just waiting. As dawn crept in, the storm finally began to ease. The howling winds faded to a whisper, and the snow settled into a thick, frozen blanket over the mountains. Grady rose stiffly, stretching out the ache in his muscles. His breath clouded in the frigid morning air. He nudged Ezra with the toe of his boot. "Wake up," Ezra groaned, blinking blearily up at him. "What?" "Storm's past. We move soon." Ezra pushed himself up, wincing. "You think they're still out there?" Grady didn't answer right away. He stepped to the window, wiping away a layer of frost with his sleeve. Outside, the world was blindingly white. Trees bent under the weight of fresh snow. No footprints, no movement. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I ain't taking chances." Ezra swallowed hard, rubbing warmth back into his fingers. "So what's the plan?" Grady turned back to him, his expression grim. "We get off this mountain, fast." Ezra nodded, but Grady could see the doubt in his eyes. They both knew the truth. Moving through deep snow was slow, exhausting work. If Boone and his men were still hunting them, they wouldn't need to rush. They would just need to wait. Grady pulled on his coat and slung his pack over his shoulder. He checked his rifle, making sure the powder was dry. Then he reached for the door handle. A sound stopped him cold. Crunch. Somewhere outside, just beyond sight. A footstep in the snow. Grady's grip tightened on his rifle. His eyes flicked to Ezra, who had heard it too. "Get down," Grady whispered. Ezra dropped low, inching away from the fire's glow. Grady moved slowly to the window, careful not to make a sound. His heart pounded as he peered through the frost-covered glass. At first he saw nothing but white, then movement, a shadow slipping between the trees. Another, then another. Boone's men had found them, and this time there was no storm to keep them at bay. Grady clenched his jaw, his grip tightening around his rifle. His worst fear had come true. Boone and his men had waited out the storm, using the blizzard as cover to creep in close. Now they were here. Ezra swallowed hard, his breath shallow. "How many?" he whispered. Grady kept his voice low. "At least 3, maybe more. They're spread out." Ezra cursed under his breath, running a hand through his hair. "They ain't leaving, are they?" "No," Grady said. "They ain't." The weight of the truth settled between them. Boone wasn't the kind of man to give up. Not after coming this far. Grady scanned the cabin, his mind racing through possibilities. They couldn't stay inside, not unless they wanted to be trapped, like cornered animals. But running in broad daylight through waist-deep snow, that was suicide. They needed an advantage. Grady turned to Ezra. "We're not going to win a straight fight, but we can make 'em regret coming here." Ezra nodded quickly, his desperation shifting to something harder, sharper. "What do we do?" Grady glanced at the fireplace. "First, we kill the fire. No more light." Ezra grabbed a nearby bucket of snow and dumped it over the flames. The fire hissed and sputtered before dying, plunging the cabin into icy darkness. Grady moved next, grabbing a few wooden planks from the corner. He helped me board up the windows, slow 'em down. The two men worked fast, nailing wooden slats across the openings. It wouldn't hold forever, but it would force Boone's men to break their way in, making them predictable. Grady stepped back, exhaling. The cabin was now a fortress, but it wouldn't stay one for long. A voice called out from the trees. "Monroe!" Grady stiffened. He knew that voice. "Boone! You know why we're here!" Boone shouted, his voice carrying over the snow. "Send Crowley out, and this don't have to end ugly." Ezra paled. "They're going to kill me," he whispered. Grady didn't answer. He already knew that. Boone kept talking. "You ain't got a way out, Monroe. You ain't got nowhere to run." Grady exchanged a glance with Ezra. Boone was right about one thing. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and surrounded. But there was one thing Boone didn't know. Grady Monroe had spent his whole life fighting against impossible odds, and he wasn't about to stop now. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. Then he raised his rifle and whispered to Ezra, "Get ready." Outside, the first boot crunched against the snow. The fight for their lives had begun. Grady pressed his back against the cabin wall, his pulse steady despite the tension in the air. The old instincts kicked in, the ones that had kept him alive through gunfights, ambushes, and bitter winters. Outside, Boone and his men spread out, their boots crunching in the snow as they moved into position. Ezra gripped his pistol with white-knuckled fingers. "You got a plan?" he whispered. Grady nodded toward the back door. "They'll expect us to hole up, let them come in. But we ain't doing that." Ezra swallowed. "We're leaving?" "We're flanking." Ezra's eyes widened, but he didn't argue. He knew they couldn't win a straight-up fight. Grady moved quickly, checking his revolver and rifle. "When I give the word, we slip out the back. Stay low. Stay quiet. We move fast, take out the one closest to the cabin, then get to higher ground." Ezra nodded, sucking in a sharp breath. "And if they see us—" Grady gave him a grim look. "Then we don't stop running." A long silence stretched between them. Then a crash! The front door splintered as a boot slammed against it. Boone's men were making their move. Grady acted fast. He yanked the back door open just enough to slip through, motioning for Ezra to follow. The cold night swallowed them as they stepped into the storm. Snow crunched under their feet as they crept along the side of the cabin, keeping low. The wind howled, covering their movements. A shadow moved up ahead, a man, rifle in hand, his breath fogging in the frigid air. Grady didn't hesitate. He raised his revolver and fired. The shot cracked through the night like a whip. The man dropped without a sound, collapsing into the snow. Ezra gasped, but Grady was already moving. "Go, now!" They sprinted toward the tree line as shouts rang out behind them. "Over there!" Boone's voice bellowed. Gunfire erupted. Bullets hissed through the air, kicking up snow at their heels. Grady pushed forward, forcing his legs to move faster. The trees loomed ahead. Cover, safety. Ezra stumbled, cursing as he nearly fell. Grady grabbed his coat, hauling him upright. "Keep moving." They hit the tree line just as another shot cracked. Past them, splintering the bark of a nearby trunk, Grady dove behind a fallen log, dragging Ezra with him. The gunfire stopped. Silence. The only sound was the wind whistling through the trees. Ezra panted, his chest heaving. "Did we lose 'em?" Grady shook his head, gripping his rifle. No. He peered through the darkness. Boone's men weren't firing anymore, because they were hunting now, and the real fight was just beginning. The woods swallowed them whole. Snow clung to the trees like ghosts, the storm howling through the branches as Grady and Ezra crouched behind the fallen log. The night was thick with silence, except for the slow, deliberate crunch of boots in the snow. "They ain't firing anymore," Ezra whispered, barely audible over the wind. "That ain't good, is it?" Grady shook his head. "They're spreading out, trying to box us in." He knew Boone's tactics too well. The man had been a bounty hunter once, before he'd turned to easier prey, scared men with gold to steal. Boone didn't waste bullets. He preferred to take his time. Grady scanned the darkness, his fingers tight on his rifle. "We gotta move, but not fast. Stick to the shadows, keep low." Ezra swallowed hard and nodded. They slunk deeper into the forest, weaving between the trees. The cold burned Grady's lungs, but he ignored it, listening, really listening. Years of surviving alone in the mountains had sharpened his senses. A branch snapped to their left. Grady stopped, holding up a hand. Ezra froze. Another sound, closer this time. A slow exhale. Grady's eyes flicked to the shape barely visible between the trees, a silhouette against the pale glow of the snow. One of Boone's men, the bastard, was waiting. Grady moved first. He raised his revolver and fired in one smooth motion. The gunshot shattered the silence, and the man crumpled, his rifle falling from his grip. Ezra flinched. "Jesus! Move!" Grady hissed. They ran. Shouts echoed behind them. More men closing in. The woods weren't thick enough to hide in forever. Grady veered sharply to the right, leading them up a narrow ridge. The climb was steep, the snow slick beneath their boots, but he knew where they were headed. Ezra gasped for breath. "Oh, where are we going?" Grady didn't answer. Not yet. A bullet whizzed past, hitting a tree trunk inches from Ezra's head. He yelped, ducking instinctively. "They're gaining!" Grady cursed under his breath. Not if he could help it. They reached the top of the ridge, and there it was, an old trapper's hideout, barely more than a pile of rocks and broken wood. It wasn't much, but it was cover. "In there!" Grady ordered. They scrambled inside just as another shot rang out. Wood splintered near the entrance. Ezra hit the ground, panting. "We ain't going to make it, are we?" Grady checked his bullets. "Not if we sit here waiting to die." Outside, the crunch of footsteps drew closer. Boone's men weren't rushing. They thought they had them cornered. Big mistake. Grady exhaled, steadying his aim. "Let's show 'em they're wrong." The first man came into view, his rifle raised as he stepped cautiously toward the ruined hideout. His breath steamed in the freezing air, his eyes scanning the darkness inside. Grady fired first. The shot hit the man square in the chest, sending him tumbling backward into the snow. His rifle clattered beside him, steam rising from the blood spreading across his coat. Ezra flinched. "Jesus!" Grady didn't hesitate. He pulled Ezra lower, pressing him against the broken wall. "Stay down and reload when I tell you." More voices. Outside. Boone's men were getting smarter, moving slower, using cover. They knew Grady wasn't an easy kill. A shot blasted through the rotting wood above them, showering them with splinters. Grady cursed. They had to move. "Follow me," he barked, grabbing Ezra by the collar and dragging him toward the back of the shelter. Ezra stumbled but kept up, gripping his revolver like it was the only thing keeping him alive, which, at this point, it was. Grady kicked at the weak section of the back wall, sending rotten logs tumbling outward. Cold air rushed in along with the swirling snow. They bolted. Shots rang out behind them, but the storm was thick, the darkness on their side. Grady knew these mountains better than Boone's men. He led them down a narrow slope, their boots sliding dangerously over the icy ground. Ezra gasped. "We ain't going to outrun 'em forever." "Not trying to," Grady muttered. He had a plan. The frozen river lay ahead, its surface slick and treacherous. Most men wouldn't dare cross it in the dead of night, but Grady wasn't most men. He grabbed Ezra's arm. "Stick to my steps. Move fast. Don't stop." Ezra's eyes widened. "We're crossing that." Grady didn't answer. He was already moving. The ice groaned beneath their boots. Each step had to be careful, deliberate. The river was shallow in some parts, but the wrong step could send them plunging into frigid waters, certain death in this cold. Behind them, Boone's men reached the edge of the trees. Grady heard Boone curse. "They're on the damn river." The first shot cracked through the night. A bullet hit the ice near Grady's foot, sending shards flying. Ezra yelped. "They're shooting at the ice!" Smart bastards. Grady quickened his pace. The far side of the river was close now, if they could make it. A gunshot rang out. Ezra cried out, stumbling forward onto the ice. Grady spun. "Ezra!" Ezra clutched his leg. Blood, dark against the white snow. "They got me." Grady's jaw clenched. No time to panic. He grabbed Ezra, hoisting him up despite the younger man's weight. More shots. Cracks spread across the ice. Grady pushed forward, half carrying Ezra. His legs burned, his breath came in ragged clouds. The river groaned beneath them. Then, a deafening crack. The ice shattered. Grady barely had time to curse before the world beneath him gave way. The freezing water swallowed them whole. Grady's lungs seized as the icy shock ripped through his body. It was like being stabbed by 1,000 needles at once. He fought against the pull of the current, his arms flailing, trying to find something, anything, to grab onto. Ezra was worse off. The younger man thrashed wildly, his wounded leg useless in the water. His face surfaced for a brief second, eyes wide with terror. Grady! Grady lunged forward, his fingers catching the collar of Ezra's coat. He pulled hard, kicking his legs to push them upward. The river was shallow here, but the current was merciless. Chunks of broken ice spun around them, jagged and deadly. Boone's men had stopped shooting. They stood at the river's edge, watching, waiting. Grady knew what they were thinking. Let the river kill them. He refused to let that happen. With one last desperate push, he shoved Ezra toward a floating sheet of ice. Grab on. Ezra's shaking fingers found purchase, his chest heaving. Grady reached for the edge, but his hands were numb. His body was starting to shut down. No, not like this. With a growl, he forced his arm upward and caught the ice. His muscles screamed in protest as he hauled himself up, rolling onto the frozen surface beside Ezra. For a moment, they just lay there, gasping. Then, Boone's voice carried through the storm. "They're still alive." Grady lifted his head. Boone and his men had spread out along the riverbank. They weren't rushing forward. They were watching, waiting. Grady's mind raced. They had lost their rifles in the fall. His revolver was useless, soaked through. Ezra's wound was bad. If they didn't get him warm soon, the cold would finish what the bullet started. He forced himself up. "We keep moving," Ezra groaned. "I don't think I can—" "You will." Grady grabbed him under the arm, dragging him to his feet. "We ain't dying out here." Boone's men started moving again. They were taking their time, following the riverbank. They knew Grady and Ezra wouldn't make it far in this condition. Grady's jaw tightened. They thought this was over. They were wrong. Grady knew they had minutes, maybe less, before the cold drained what little strength they had left. The river had spared them from Boone's bullets, but it had delivered a slow, merciless execution of its own. Ezra could barely stand, his wounded leg dragging uselessly behind him. His lips had turned pale, and his breath came in ragged gasps. Grady tightened his grip on him. "Come on, one step at a time." Ezra tried, but his knees buckled. "Grady, I can't." Grady cursed under his breath. He looked around, searching for anything, shelter, high ground, anything that could buy them time. The river snaked through a ravine, ice-covered rocks lining the banks. Ahead, a tangle of fallen trees formed a natural barricade. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. He half-dragged, half-carried Ezra toward the trees, pushing through the numbing pain in his limbs. Behind them, Boone's men kept pace, their boots crunching through the snow. "Nowhere to run, Monroe." Boone's voice rang through the freezing air. "You can fight it all you want, but you know how this ends." Grady ignored him. He reached the fallen trees and shoved Ezra down behind the thickest trunk. "Stay low," he ordered, kneeling beside him. His hands fumbled with his revolver, fingers stiff and useless from the cold. The gun was soaked, but it might still fire. One shot. That was all he needed. Ezra groaned, barely conscious. His head lolled to the side. Grady clenched his jaw. He wasn't losing him. Not to Boone, not to the cold. He peeked over the log. Boone and his men were closing in, their rifles raised. Grady took a deep breath. Then he made his move. With a burst of energy, he swung his revolver up and pulled the trigger. The shot cracked through the frozen air. Boone jerked back, cursing as the bullet whizzed past his head. "Son of a—" Grady didn't wait. He grabbed a handful of snow and shoved it into Ezra's wound, ignoring the sharp gasp of pain. "Stay awake! Damn it!" Then he turned, ready to face Boone's men. The fight wasn't over. Not yet. Grady's breath was steady, his eyes locked onto Boone as the tension in the room thickened like the winter air outside. Ezra swallowed hard, his fingers twitching as if he were considering making a run for it, but there was nowhere to go. Not with Boone and his men blocking the door, and not with the storm howling outside like a hungry beast. "You ain't got no call to be here, Boone," Grady said, his voice low and measured. "This ain't your fight." Boone chuckled, stepping further. Into the cabin, shaking the snow off his coat. His men followed suit, closing the door behind them. The firelight flickered, casting long, shifting shadows across their faces. "See, that's where you're wrong," Boone said. "When a man crosses us, it don't matter where he runs. We settle our debts." Ezra exhaled sharply, his voice barely above a whisper. "Please." Boone turned to him, his grin widening. "Now, don't start begging, boy. Makes you look weak." Grady didn't like the way Boone was toying with Ezra. It meant he wasn't in a rush to kill him, not yet, anyway. Boone liked to savor his work. That was his weakness. Grady's mind raced. He had to get control of the situation before it spiraled beyond his reach. He wasn't about to let some low-life drifter like Ezra drag him into a fight he didn't ask for, but he wasn't going to let Boone and his men turn his cabin into a slaughterhouse either. Boone reached inside his coat and Grady's grip on. His revolver tightened, but Boone wasn't pulling iron, he was pulling a flask. He took a slow sip, smacked his lips, and sighed. "Tell you what, Monroe," Boone said, "ain't got no quarrel with you. Hand Crowley over, and we'll be out of your hair. Simple as that." Grady didn't move. The fire crackled between them, the only sound in the suffocating silence. Ezra looked at Grady, desperation in his eyes. He was hoping, praying, that Grady wasn't the kind of man to hand another over to the wolves. Grady sighed. "And if I say no," Boone grinned wider, "then we do things the hard way." The fire popped. The wind howled. And Grady made his choice. Without a word, he moved like a coiled snake, striking, his revolver flashing in the firelight. Boone barely had time to flinch before Grady's bullet tore through his shoulder, spinning him backward. Boone's flask hit the floor, the liquor spilling like blood. For a split second, the cabin erupted into chaos. Boone's men scrambled, reaching for their weapons, but Grady was already moving, flipping the table over for cover. Ezra yelped and dove behind a chair as bullets tore through the cabin walls. The fight was on. Gunfire roared inside the small cabin, the sharp cracks of revolvers drowning out the howling wind outside. Splinters flew as bullets tore through wood, shattering furniture and peppering the walls with jagged holes. Grady moved fast, his instincts honed by years of surviving both the wilderness and men like Boone. He ducked behind the overturned table, his Colt Navy revolver steady in his grip. He fired again, the muzzle flash lighting up the dark room for a split second. One of Boone's men grunted and stumbled back, clutching his side. Ezra was cowering behind a broken chair, his hands over his head. "Grady, what the hell do we do?" "Shut up and stay down," Grady barked, already reloading. His fingers worked quickly, sliding fresh rounds into the chamber. Boone was on the ground, groaning as he clutched his wounded shoulder, but he wasn't out of the fight yet. He gritted his teeth and rolled to the side, yanking a knife from his boot. His men, still standing, were returning fire, their shots slamming into the heavy wooden beams of the cabin. One of them, a wiry bastard with a thick beard, made a move for the door. Grady saw it and took his shot. His bullet caught the man in the thigh, sending him crashing to the ground with a scream. Ezra was scrambling now, trying to reach something, anything, he could use. His fingers found an old rifle leaning against the wall, half covered in dust. He grabbed it, fumbling with the lever. Another shot whizzed past Grady's ear, close enough that he felt the heat of it. He grit his teeth. They were pinned down, but Boone's men were just as exposed. Grady peeked over the table for just a second, just enough to see Boone push himself up, blood staining his coat. "You son of a—" Boone snarled, lifting his gun. Grady didn't give him the chance. His revolver barked and Boone's gun flew from his grip as he roared in pain. Ezra finally got his rifle loaded. He clumsily aimed and fired. The shot went wide, smashing a lantern on the far wall. Oil spilled, and suddenly flames leapt up, licking at the dry wood of the cabin. "Damn it, Ezra," Grady swore. Smoke curled toward the ceiling, filling the cabin with the thick, choking scent of burning oil. The fire was spreading fast. Boone's men panicked. The one with the leg wound crawled toward the door, dragging himself through the snow. Another turned and bolted, smashing through a window in his desperation to escape the flames. That left Boone. Grady stood slowly, gun still raised. Boone was breathing heavily, his wounded arm hanging useless at his side, his face twisted in pain and rage. This ain't over. Boone spat. Grady cocked the hammer of his revolver. It is for you. But Boone was already moving. He lunged, shoulder first, crashing into Grady before he could fire. The gun went off, the shot going wild. They slammed into the cabin wall, knocking over a shelf of supplies. Boone was strong despite his wounds. He swung his good arm, landing a brutal punch to Grady's ribs. Pain exploded in Grady's side, but he didn't let go of his gun. Ezra, still gripping the rifle uselessly, stared in shock. "Do something, you idiot," Grady snapped as he struggled with Boone. Ezra finally reacted. He swung the rifle like a club, bringing it down hard on Boone's back. Boone grunted, stumbling just enough for Grady to twist free. Grady didn't hesitate. He drove his knee into Boone's gut, then grabbed him by the collar and hurled him toward the flames. Boone hit the burning wall with a crash, his coat instantly catching fire. He let out a terrible scream, flailing as he tried to beat out the flames. The fire spread quickly, devouring the wooden cabin like a hungry beast. "We gotta get out of here," Ezra yelled. Grady didn't argue. He grabbed his pack, shoved his revolver into its holster, and kicked open the door. The storm outside was still raging, but it was better than burning alive. Ezra stumbled out after him, coughing from the smoke. Behind them, the cabin was already lost to the flames, turning into a roaring inferno. Boone was still inside, his screams fading into the crackling fire. Grady took a deep breath of cold air, wiping soot from his face. He turned to Ezra. "You just had to pick my cabin, didn't you?" Ezra gave him a sheepish grin, still trembling. "Lucky me." Grady shook his head. The night had nearly killed them both, but they weren't dead yet, and out here, that was all that mattered.